I'm going to just share. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, which feels like a very odd way, in a way, to talk about these things that are really about the complexities of human existence. But it's one way to try to share some of this through Zoom and on computers. So I'm going to share my screen. Feel free to, yeah, sit back and enjoy. Here we go. So this is where we were before, when we went into that exercise. Sorry, just exploring these pairs of archetypes. So yeah, the reason that I think this is interesting is because so many different cultures with such a different way of being in the world have said something about health relating to these. And you know, back in the day, I was an engineer, and part of what engineers do is they ask, you know, what is it about a system that causes it to behave in a certain way? So I was curious. I was in transition when I was really with this inquiry. I was with the tension of that being and doing conflict. And I don't know if this feels familiar to any of you that have been in sort of positive change projects, people trying to set up communities and people trying to get groups going. But this tension between action, we need to do stuff, we need to get our energy systems in place, we need to build houses, you know, and we need to pay attention to process. We need to take care of each other. We need to think about the language we use and how we deal with conflict. I feel like it's something that has been splitting people and projects, you know, for decades. So, you know, I can recognize it back in the 80s when I first started coming into radical projects for positive change. But there it is, still going on. And, you know, you may or may not resonate with that and things you've been involved with. So I was really interested in being and doing. I was really interested in burnout. So for me, one of the you know, sort of collisions in transition is that we were all about healing a culture that was burning out the planet, but our movement, like many others, was causing huge amounts of burnout in the people that were part of it. And it was happening in me. And even though I was aware of it, I was really struggling to be not constantly on the edge of burnout. And I saw many other people, and especially it was people that identified more with the kind of being part of this equation. So I got really curious about it, both as a thing that helped us define what health is, but also what maybe takes us out of health. And with my engineering head on, I was interested in trauma and the unconscious, and I was interested in stress. And during the sort of years 2005 onwards, there was a lot of stuff coming out in the West about trauma. Peter Levine's work was starting to be widely shared. So that sense of the embodied nature of trauma, trauma relating to our nervous systems, to cortisol, to sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I got really interested in the question, do these archetypes have anything to do with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? So this is the sort of model in a way that explores that question. So here's my proposal for maybe what healthy human culture looks like, is that we have these two parts of our nervous system, and what's helpful to know about the autonomous nervous system, which has these two parts, is not only does it organize how we are, what we are doing, what our bodies, muscles and organs and heart rate and the chemicals that are flowing around our body, but it also organizes what we perceive. Does that make sense? So it's also organizing what we're looking for when we make sense of the huge amount of sensory information that's coming in. So it's like it sets filters. So this is a huge organization of our consciousness that goes on through the autonomous nervous system. And I came up with this as a sort of proposition for the fundamental state of healthy human culture, is that we have a balance and flow between sympathetic and parasympathetic. Does that make sense? So the sympathetic is what organizes us to act. It's our mobilizing system, and the parasympathetic is what helps us to be both interacting with other people, but also resting and digesting, literally digesting our food, but also soothing and calming and digesting our experience, integrating what's happened to us. And when I started to read more about these, I found some things that were really confusing. So one was, whenever I looked up sympathetic nervous system on Google, it told me it was a flight-fight system. It was a system that organized us to either get into confrontation, physical fight, or to run away from things. And I sat with this question, what about playing football? You know, what about when I want to dance? What about when my body needs energy and increased heart rate to be playful? Is that sympathetic? And it took me quite a long time to establish that, yes, it absolutely, definitely is. And so I was curious about that. Why is there so much focus in our culture on sympathetic nervous system, not as something enjoyable, playful, competent, but as something that's an emergency, a response to an emergency threat? And the parasympathetic, you know, Stephen Porges sort of identified two different parts to that. So I'm going to add this into the kind of ground state, which is one bit of the parasympathetic puts us into negotiating. So when we have a bit of stress, these lines going to the right, stress comes into the system, but that stress might be playful stress, isn't it? I want to play football. You know, I'm going to stretch my body. I'm going to get into a competitive environment. You know, I might even get into some anger. You know, if somebody fouls me or somebody fouls one of my teammates was what really used to get me upset when I played football. But it's also fun. You know, it's also, yeah, it's also developmental. It's also growth. So here's a kind of ground state of human activity. You know, we take action. And if we think of Stone Age people, you know, back in the day when our nervous systems and our bodies were evolving, this might be, you know, the things we did to meet our needs, but also play, going and hunting, foraging, gathering, exercising, swimming. And then we would come together and we would, you know, rest, we would connect with each other, we would be, you know, back at the hearth, we would be holding the children, we'd be with the older ones and so on, and we would sleep. And for me, one way of understanding human culture is there are these two archetypes. And then what I haven't put on here is there are cultural patterns that keep these in their right relationship. So, you know, the rituals of the day, how do we wake up? What do we do first thing? How do we eat together? At the end of the day, how do we come together and digest our experience? Maybe we tell stories around the fire. You know, maybe we have a family meal together. Maybe we have a meeting, you know, at the end of a project that we've been doing. Maybe we celebrate, you know, at the shifting of the seasons. So here's the sort of ground state of healthy human being. And, you know, we go out into this stretch state and I think we easily come back into it. So here we add more stress into the system. And now we've got some kind of stress or threat that's taking us away from this being able to resolve it just by negotiation. So again, a useful insight, I can't find the reference to it, but I found it somewhere, is that for most primates, our key stress, most of our stress, the events that cause our stress, 95% of them are not the tiger in the jungle, and it's not the tribe over the hill. Most of our stress is to do with our relationships with the people that we live with. So in a troop of baboons, you know, most of the stress that's activating stress responses are to do with, you know, dealings with our peers, with the elders, you know, with the children, with the ones that knock us back into line when we don't obey the rules or put somebody at risk. So we may get into flight and fight within our peer group. There may be a stress that comes in from outside. And this again is Porges's polyvagal theory. So I've put that reference at the top there. He describes this hierarchy of responses to emergency states. The first is flight. It's more efficient to run away. If we can't run away, we may go into a fight response. There are some others that people have added, but I just want to include these three so it doesn't get too complicated for now. And the third one is the dorsal vagal, so this parasympathetic freeze. So if we can't run away and we don't think we're going to lose the fight, we're going to win the fight, we may just completely shut down. And one of the things, again, very helpful to know, and he really emphasizes it in his work, is that autonomous nervous system is making decisions for us out of our awareness. Does that make sense? So we may be put into fight before we've even noticed, you know, that we're in a stressful situation. Our body's revved up and we're ready to, you know, fight for our lives. These are emergency threat situations. I'm ready for that confrontation. Or, you know, I've gone into a situation and I feel completely overwhelmed and I literally can't move. My autonomous nervous system has immobilized me. So something like stage fright, you know, it's no good beating ourselves up in those situations. We had no choice. It's, you know, something happened to me and I couldn't defend myself. My autonomous nervous system made a decision that actually it's better not to do anything about it. So all of this is part of human culture, right? These situations happen, whether the threat comes from outside or from within, whether it's a human being or a tiger in the jungle, you know, whether it's a car accident or a, you know, an attack on the street, whatever the situation is, all of these are evolved nervous system responses that are intended to keep us safe. So in healthy culture, what happens when we've gone into flight, fight or freeze? And this is my sort of proposition, is that there's some kind of what I call a return path. So whether we've gone into flight or fight or all the way to freeze, there's something that helps us to feel held, to feel supported, to release that stress out of our system. So we're talking about individuals here. And what we know, again, in the West, maybe we're just catching up with what Indigenous people have known and done for a very long time, is that there's always a physical component if we've gone all the way into freeze or to fight, flight. So something needs to be discharged through our bodies. There's often an emotional component, so something in the experience of feeling terrified, maybe feeling helpless. You know, we got into fight, but we lost the fight, feeling powerless, maybe feeling isolated or unresourced. There may be a big emotional component to that. So I don't know if anybody just wants to unmute, you know, what kind of things might a return path be? You know, if we think about traditional cultures, indigenous cultures, anything that you know of that has been, you know, that you think might be a way that human beings have come back from states of extreme stress. What kind of thing might that be? Just unmute and chip in if you feel to. I'll make some suggestions, what I see.
Welcoming and being welcomed.
Lovely, yeah. So just the simple act of being welcomed. And there might be more if we needed, if I'd really gone into fight flight, what else might I need, as well as maybe it's an embrace that you mean, Dita, you know, is that right? Like a physical being pulled into my body. Anyone want to add? I can't see everybody, but I'll give a couple of examples. Maybe that's helpful.
Allocation, a couple of great ones in the chat. Sitting down on the floor, I sometimes feel I have to do it while brushing my teeth on anxious days.
Fantastic.
And closing eyes and breathing deeply.
Lovely, lovely, lovely story that I heard from Rob, who asked one of the grandmothers of Standing Rock, you know, where there were people on the front line being tear gassed and, you know, attacked by the people trying to stop the protests to prevent the pipeline being built, being created at Standing Rock. And he asked this grandmother, you know, what do you do when people come back off the front line? And she said, we put them in a sweat lodge. It's like, is, you know, is that a return path? Is that a technology for bringing people out of shock, out of fight and flight, and maybe even freeze? I'm curious if the grief ceremonies that I learnt about from Sobonfu, if they're return paths where there's music and dancing and drumming, where there's physical holding, you're invited to go and just, you know, express to the shrine whatever is moving for you. And I think there are probably lots of others, ecstatic dances, rituals, ceremonies. And in the West, you know, we now have kind of trauma release exercises, you know, one-to-one spaces. So for me, this is what a healthy human culture would have. And, you know, sometimes if there's been a huge shock, we may need to just wait a little bit. So sometimes it's like, there can be a shock that's frozen in our body and we need to wait a little bit for it to come to the surface before we're ready. I don't know if anybody's been through any really profound bereavements or, you know, losses or whatever recently, but sometimes it's like we need to come out a little bit. So maybe not immediately, but at some point soon after, when things are ready to move, you know, we might have had a ceremony or had a healing process. So this for me is what healthy human cultures are. And I call this purple arrow, holding and support to release stress, the return path. And I would say that collective return paths are an essential part of healthy cultures. So we're going to just keep going with this map. So this is the big question. What happens if that return path fails? What happens if we're in a culture where those return paths don't exist as a normalized part of collective existence and daily life? And this is what I'm going to suggest happens. Oh. So we have a threat or overwhelm. Let me just see if this is all going to work. And then there's a failure of the return path. And this is my sort of proposition around trauma, is that trauma is a two-stage process. So often we talk about it in the West as if just the threat, something very overwhelming happened to me, and I was traumatized. But I think this failure of the return path is a second stage of trauma, because if we were living in a healthy culture and the return paths were there as a daily part of our existence, we wouldn't get all the way to trauma. Something shocking would happen and then there would be a way back. And actually, if the return path is working, the shocks and the, you know, extreme events teach us about our community resilience. If something major happens to me or to a group of us, but a ceremony happens and we all integrate it, what we learn is together we can deal with really serious things happening to us, and we grow and we strengthen our technologies to come back from events that might be overwhelming. So for me, this is a really helpful insight. Again, you know, it's not originally mine. I first met it in one of my supervisors. I was working in a project for people that have been sexually abused. And, you know, it's there in the Wisdom of Trauma film, if anybody's seen it. Gabor Mate says to somebody, you know, what happened when you tried to speak to somebody about the abuse? And it's like, you know, nobody would listen. They wouldn't believe me. He said, that's the abuse. But I think it's both. It's the abuse followed by the lack of response, the failure of adults to listen, that creates trauma. So now we have a system where we're getting all the way to trauma, there's no way back. So then what happens next? And I'm going to just do a bit of a jump now. So this was talking about individuals and the individual nervous systems. And this is my sort of question. For me, it's a big question about this whole body of work, but I still think it's helpful, and we'll see if you agree, is, you know, the individual, oops, sorry, I keep clicking my thing. The individual has the autonomous nervous system. And this is my proposition, if you like, that as we go from individuals to the collective, we go from nervous system states to cultural archetypes. And we go from a body that is organized by sympathetic and parasympathetic to culture that gets organized by cultural archetypes. And here are some of the sort of epistemologies, if you like, systems of understanding human behavior and their health and the ways that the archetypes have shown up. So there's a few more than we used in our exercise. So we're making a jump now from the individual to the collective. And here's healthy culture, and another jump, but here's a map of what unhealthy culture looks like. So, you know, we had a ground state, there was fight, flight, freeze states. Somewhere along the way, our cultural return path fails, which isn't spelt right. And now what we have on the right-hand side is culture organizing in a way where we're pervaded by residual trauma states. Does that make sense? So now we've got lots of people that have got, on the top is the hyperactive response. So we go into fight or flight very quickly. And the lower half of the right-hand side are the hypo aroused. So there's an under responsiveness. So it's like there's a residue of freeze. I've added fawn in here because I think it's quite a prevalent one. So fawn is placating, appeasing, submitting. I'll do whatever it takes to survive, but I'll give away all of my power and my autonomy. So now we have culture where these states are prevalent. And I want to say, I don't think there's any culture that exists which is only here. So for me, the culture that I grew up in, every organization, every family that I know has got all of this. Does that make sense? It's got the capacity for health, for balance, for care and love integrated with strength and power. But it's also got parts of its culture, parts of its system where we get into triggered states that take us to the right-hand side, and we're over or under reactive to stress responses. So I'm just going to make some suggestions about how I see that appearing in culture. And you know, you may have your own ideas. We're just going to have a bit of time when I finish this to see how these things land in you and what's if anything resonates for you. But this is some of the ways that I see this happening in culture. Is, you know, over on the right hand side we see some people who identify with the fight response, and they're people that will be really quickly into dominating, into bullying, into aggression. And we can see that, I think, really clearly in some world leaders, you know, people like Trump, who are like, just, I'm going to get what I want, I don't care about anyone else. Sort of psychopathic structures, very lacking in empathic ability to sense what other people are feeling or care about it. But another sort of hyperactive state can be keep moving, don't stop, get busy. And I think this is part of what was happening in transition. We were driven by fear, and a fear of the intensity and the urgency of the times. And actually we were in a kind of constant flight mode where we were, yeah, just keep going, keep going, keep going, don't stop. The lower half, the sort of under responsive, or down here, it's like we've lost touch with the health of this archetype. So down here, we're in the distortions of love and relating and sensitivity. So we're in a kind of powerlessness, collapse. You know, maybe we care, but there's not much we can do about it. But also it's like, well, I'll do whatever it takes to just stay safe. So yeah, I'll do whatever the majority do. I'll do whatever I'm told. So just noticing how these are in touch with one archetype and have lost touch with the other. So up here, we're in touch with our capacity, we're in touch with our strength, our ability to keep going, our ability to dominate, but we've lost touch with heart, with love, with relationship, with quality care and sensitivity. And down here, we're in the opposite distortion of archetypes. So part of what this map does, which is part of what I was seeking, I couldn't find it when I put this map together. It feels like it's much more around these days, you know, 2021 instead of 2008, 9, 10, is to put together an understanding of somatics, of neuroscience, of bodies, of the unconscious, of trauma with systems of power and oppression. And for me, this map explains how those who identify with this archetype around strength, so maybe, you know, we've got a better weapons technology, maybe we're the ones that have got most of the wealth, maybe my body's stronger than your body, you know, can deal with what's in here. So underlying this whole system on the right is the experience of trauma. So this experience where I was overwhelmed, where I was terrified, where I felt powerless, where there wasn't any help, where nobody helped me afterwards. My community had no resources to bring me back to life, and I just had to go into survival mode. And this feeling of terror, of fear. So the whole of this side of the map is pervaded by fear. And those who have more strength in this system can kind of create a group that uses its strength to avoid feeling these feelings of helplessness. I think there's shame and worthlessness in here, and can actually physically put those feelings into somebody else's body. So a lot of the kind of cultural somatics, people like Resmaa Menakem, but you know, others are writing about black body, white body. But we could do the same about male body, female body, you know, about able-bodied people and those with disabilities, about people with wealth, people in poverty, you know, refugees, homelessness, how people with power disassociate from their own vulnerability. That's not me. I don't do vulnerability. If I did vulnerability, if I did inner work, if I sat still for too long, I might start to touch into this, and I'm not resourced to deal with that. So I'm just going to keep going, keep getting what I want, keep moving and pushing all of the pain into another part of the system. So the last bit that I'm going to say is about a system's relationship to pain, because for me it's a really crucial organizing characteristic, is that over here pain is organizing the system, but the system is averse to feeling it. You know, these are the guys, these are the ones that are writing the books and framing. They don't do pain. There's lots of pain in the system, but it's mainly being felt by people who have less voice, who have less power, who are less visible. So it's in the system, and there's a disconnect between systems of power and the places where pain is felt. You know, back over here, if we had a healthy culture, there would be places where pain would be being felt, and we would be making meaning together of that pain. So one part of the return path that I think is really essential is collective spaces where pain is surfaced and understood. And if you can see, it's easy to see, isn't it? If we don't have that, where there's a harm in the system, there's no feedback loop. You know, the engineer in me wants to say, if we aren't making meaning out of the pain in the system, and maybe we aren't even hearing it, actually, the most important feedback signal in the system is being lost. So, you know, some of you know that's part of the reason why I do collective grief tending. I think we need to rework our systems for healing, for hearing and making sense of pain, of grief, of suffering together. Is that over here, pain is organizing the system, but the system is averse to feeling it. You know, these are the guys, these are the ones that are writing the books and framing. They don't do pain. There's lots of pain in the system, but it's mainly being felt by people who have less voice, who have less power, who are less visible. So it's in the system, and there's a disconnect between systems of power and the places where pain is felt. You know, back over here, if we had a healthy culture, there would be places where pain would be being felt and we would be making meaning together of that pain. So one part of the return path that I think is really essential is collective spaces where pain is surfaced and understood. And if you can see, it's easy to see, isn't it? If we don't have that, where there's a harm in the system, there's no feedback loop. You know, the engineer in me wants to say, if we aren't making meaning out of the pain in the system, and maybe we aren't even hearing it, actually, the most important feedback signal in the system is being lost. So, you know, some of you know that's part of the reason why I do collective grief tending. I think we need to rework our systems for healing, for hearing and making sense of pain, of grief, of suffering together. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and we're going to go into a, let's not do that, let's just go back. Let's stay with that map. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm really happy to share that presentation at the end of this, if anybody wants it, as well as the recording. But I would love us to maybe take a breath before we go off into breakout rooms. Let's just take a breath and again, come back to body. So letting go of talking, let's just have a moment, maybe a minute, whatever your body needs. Whatever you need to feel connected with your body, and inviting us to feel the earth beneath us, to feel earth, air. And you may have a body practice that helps you to come more present, tapping, stroking, soothing, sighing, breathing. So lots of words. I'm just noticing that when we even put the words trauma on screen, it may touch places in us that hold some of that. When we describe these systems, they're not just out there, they're in here, they're in my body. You know, I imagine they're in the body of everybody here somewhere. That may or may not be true. So just noticing if parts of you are touched. Yeah, and reaching out to what resources us. Feeling these great holding bodies like the earth. But we've also got our circle, our practices.